And by the way, just if I could say,
Sure.
on February 21st, 2014, 3 European foreign ministers negotiated an arrangement where Yanukovych would stay in power for several months, there would be a unity government, and there would be new national elections.
Right.
The next day, there was a violent overthrow, and within a nanosecond, the United States recognized the new government. And what did Europe say? Did Europe say, excuse me, we had an agreement, we also had an understanding with President Putin, there's a constitutional process, Yanukovych needs to come back, these violent demonstrators should not be recognized? No, Europe said, thank you, United States, we'll do whatever you say. Come on, this is not security. This is not sensible. This is not keeping anybody safe.
And you show in the book that this coup was spearheaded by the right sector, like radical right-wing groups in Ukraine. That's not meant to discredit the whole of the Maidan movement. I think the majority of the people actually were just opposed to corruption and authoritarian tendencies in Yanukovych. But it was done against the elected government by extreme right-wing forces, and I think you show that clearly. But
I've seen a number of these U.S. events, let's call them. When the Maidan started, suddenly there were new television stations all over Ukraine. There were new media outlets all over Ukraine. There were new reporters all over Ukraine. There were people organized. There were people being bussed into Kyiv and so forth. That doesn't happen spontaneously.
No.
That is organized. I happened to be in the Maidan a few weeks after February 24th, 2014. There were still people camped out in the Maidan. I was taken around the Maidan by somebody who explained to me how money was paid to organize that resistance that I was seeing before my eyes. Oh, he was paid 10,000 US. This one was paid 15,000. This is whatever some people come or didn't come. There was a lot of US in that, believe me. I know it. I saw it with my own eyes. Not to mention the fact that US senators were there pumping up the crowds, and Victoria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and is now my colleague at Columbia University, was out there passing around cookies, so-called, and more than cookies, bigger goodies, actually. She, at one point, said, well, we spent $5 billion to promote democracy in Ukraine. I know what that means. The U.S. should not be doing this on Russia's border. I don't want China overthrowing the Mexican government. I don't want China meddling in the Canadian government. I really don't. It would not feel good for American security. I don't want Russia doing that. When Russia, in analogous circumstances in 1962, said that it would put a military base and nuclear arms in Cuba, we nearly had the end of the world in the October 1962 missile crisis. The great powers should give each other space, not be face-to-face with each other, not be provoking each other, not be taunting each other, not be saying, oh, he's bluffing until the world ends. And then you don't even have time to say, oh, excuse me, I was wrong. This is how we should not be behaving. We should be giving each other space, the major powers.
Yeah, I have to say my partner is Mexican, and she's very scared of the United States, as all Mexicans are, especially at the moment, and as in the past so often. But she doesn't want any help from China or Russia.
Yeah, exactly. You could imagine that a Mexican government would say, ooh, we've got Donald Trump on our northern border. He's making demands, so we better have a great power come in.
Yeah, they are tempted, I tell you.
This would not be a good idea, honestly.
Right.
This would be the destruction of Mexico, and it would be the end of the world.
And they know that. Mexicans
I know they do. I know they do.
So in 2022, we were pretty close to a peace agreement in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine, as you show in your book. The US and Britain derailed it. Could you outline the key points of that agreement? And is a similar peace deal still possible? What do you think?
The agreement in 2022 was actually quite straightforward. It had three components in essence. One was Ukraine would be neutral, period. This is the fundamental issue for Russia. What does neutral mean? It means U.S. keep out of our neighborhood, period. That's what it means, basically. We don't want your missiles. We don't want your bases. We don't want your troops. We don't want your CIA operating all over the place. We want a neutral Ukraine. So that was the first point. The second point, quite interestingly, was not a demand for territory in the Donbass. It was essentially to implement what Germany was guarantor of, and that is the Minsk II agreement. Right. Now, this is, again, another real disappointment for me about Chancellor Merkel, who I really respected and thought she's extremely competent, but she gave in to the U.S. too many times. And in Minsk II, Germany was a guarantor of an agreement backed by the UN Security Council that said the Donbass would have autonomy within Ukraine. Not that it would become Russian, it would be an autonomous region, something like the Tyrol, Bolzano in Italy. In fact, it was really modeled on this situation in the Italian Alps, where you have a German-speaking population, and it has autonomy, but it's Italy. There's no question. And that was the idea for the Donbass. And the United States and the Ukrainians said, yeah, it's an agreement, but I was with a gun to our head. We don't have to do that. Security Council notwithstanding, Normandy process notwithstanding, German guarantee notwithstanding, blow it off. And in Istanbul, the idea was implemented. Thank you. We don't demand that territory. The third part was security guarantees that would be implemented for Ukraine, but not covering the autonomous regions and not covering Crimea, which was going to stay in Russian hands. And the basic point of Crimea is also, I think, obvious, but needs to be stated. Crimea is the base of the Russian naval fleet. It's been the naval base for Russia since Catherine the Great in 1783. This goes back basically longer than the United States of America has existed, because our Constitution is 1787 and our United States started in 1789. So this goes back before the United States even was a baby. Russia did not want Crimea to fall into NATO hands. And that's why immediately after the coup in 2014, they took back Crimea. They did it with a referendum, which probably expressed the real views of the Russians living in Crimea, but notwithstanding, no matter what, it wasn't going to happen because the Russians were not stupid. They knew what NATO wanted. The whole point of this was to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. This isn't even a secret. Zbigniew Brzezinski spelled out the U.S. strategy, which was to make Russia a second-rate, third-rate, fourth-rate power by basically taking Ukraine to, quote, our side and leaving Russia without a Black Sea outlet, without ability to move its navy into the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East and so forth. So this isn't even a secret. And so the Russians didn't want that. To come back to Istanbul, March 2022, it was a very straightforward agreement. The agreement was neutrality. We don't want your Donbass, but you have to do the Minsk II agreement, and Ukraine is ours, and we'll arrange security guarantees. The United States, deep state, said no. We have a 30-year project. We actually want this war to continue. We want to weaken Russia, as our Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin explained publicly. We have had a president then, Biden, who said publicly that man, meaning Putin, cannot stay in office. Quite an extraordinary thing that the United States decides who's the Russian president. Not just who the Ukrainian president is, but who the Russian president should be. So they didn't want to stop the war. What we've recently learned, by the way, is that starting just around that time was an intensive R&D effort to build a drone capacity in Ukraine. And, you know, war is an experimental laboratory for the United States. War in Ukraine, very convenient, no Americans dying, or very, very few. And we get to experiment. We get to develop drone warfare. We see how electronic warfare is going to work. We understand the new battlefield. After all, say these crazy compatriots of mine, we have to prepare for war with China. This is a little bit of a sideshow, but it's not a bad testing ground for our weapon systems. So recently, Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor of Biden, described how, yes, we started a big effort. He was very proud of it to make advanced drone weapons. So I think they didn't want the war to end prematurely. This would be a mistake. You know, they don't count the dead, by the way. They just don't even discuss the dead. And if the issue of the dead comes up, because it's an unpleasant issue after all, they make up completely phony numbers. I just read in the New York Times an absurd article saying that Ukraine has lost 100,000 dead and wounded. Are you kidding? It probably, when the dust has settled and demographers can actually do their work, we're going to find out it's probably 1 million dead and wounded. But the New York Times, with a straight face, and I find the paper so shamefully devoid of facts. But in any event, it said 100,000. But the real point is, you know, if you want to be a tough world empire, you don't count the dead. And the United States doesn't count the dead. So Ukraine has been basically destroyed in this process, but the U.S. got its weapon systems tested. The U.S. Thinks that it weakened Russia. Until today, we hear these deep state murmurings, and Trump repeated some deep state foolishness just yesterday, that Russia's on the ropes, the economy's collapsing, and so forth. This is the kind of the dream world in which this policy is made.
Yeah. Gaza has been destroyed even more, much more,
yes,
than Ukraine. And I have to say, I've been used to Western hypocrisy as you are for many years, but I was still a bit taken aback, and I still find it a bit hard to believe that the US, Britain, and Germany support Israel so, 100% in this genocide. And I think it needs to be called that. And in your book, you criticize this basic narrative in the West by politicians and most journalists of a global battle between the good democracies, not just good, but fundamentally good, like the forces of light, against the evil dictatorships like Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, and so on. And first of all, it's so cliche. And even if they, on balance, would be a bit better, it's still a long stretch to make it into this big Manichaean, super stark dichotomy of like super, like totally good against totally evil, because that's what they do. And Gaza, I think, has completely destroyed this narrative. Certainly for all the global south, the whole world, despite the West, which is a minority in the world, the rest of the world just looks at Gaza and see, that is our point. You think you're better just because you're liberal democracies and so on. And I don't think that, I think most of the people in the world would like to have a liberal democracy and rule of law and a modern economy, and so that I don't think they're opposed to the West, basically opposed to the Western model of running things. It's just that they remember colonial days and they know the dark side of the West, and they look at Gaza and they say, see, that's the dark side of you. And we're fed up of being lectured by you. So I feel like Gaza is a real turning point. I hope the ceasefire holds. It's a surprise that Trump seems to be responsible for it. But it was a genocide. The West supported it. And I find it stunning and shocking. So I would like you to comment on this.
Let me talk about several different dimensions of what you have just said, which I concur with. First is the issue of democracy and peace. Unfortunately, they're not very closely related. And if you go back to ancient history, the wonderful democracy of Athens in the 5th century BC was the imperialist power of the Aegean region, and it beat up the other city-states, and it was very militarized. It had lots of demagogues that wanted war. Of course, one of the reasons it ended up being defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars is that it went off into a completely ridiculous adventure in Syracusa in Sicily, and it failed terribly. But it was militaristic. It wasn't peace-loving. It was a democracy, but it was completely militaristic. But we don't have to go back so far. I just point that out to say that there's nothing about democracy and peace intrinsically. In the 19th century, it is right to say that Britain was the most democratic nation in the world. Hands down, no question, the most violent nation in the world, period. No doubt.
That was a good thing. It was a good thing in a way.
Well, the British,
for Britain.
The British Empire was very powerful. It took over at its peak around 1/4 of the entire landmass of the world. It had its crown jewel in India. There was a lot of terrible cruelty to the empire, by the way, because when famines came and El Niños hit in the second half of the 19th century, the British just left Indians to die by the millions. Right. And but here was a democracy completely militarized. What's the value of that? Now, in the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. is by far the most militaristic country in the world. It fights wars every year, everywhere. It's a democracy. It's now as much a plutocracy as a democracy because I think money votes even more than people vote in the U.S. Hence, our de facto prime minister is Elon Musk, because he basically helped finance Trump's election. But the point is, yeah, democracy, but extremely violent, overthrowing governments, coups, color revolutions, overt wars of choice on false pretenses, and all the rest. So this standard, democracy good, autocracy bad. This is childish. Maybe the politicians should go back to school for just a few weeks and learn some history or gain some perspective, or just stop the endless chatter and rhetoric. You look at China. I think Mr. Mertz recently said how dangerous China is. It's an autocracy. It doesn't have our values. China hasn't been to war one time for the last 45 years. 45 years. And the last time China was at war, it was 1 month. 1 month, mid-January to mid-February 1979, in a kind of slap of the wrist of Vietnam for having overthrown a Chinese ally in Cambodia. That's it. China doesn't do war. We do war all the time. And then they're evil. We're wonderful. What's so wonderful about that? About all this militarism? So the hypocrisy.
And let me mention that the war against Vietnam by China was supported by the CIA. We have some evidence for that now, because of course it was against the arch enemy of the Vietnamese communists.
Yes.
So the only war that China fought in the last 100 years was with the support of the US.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is so. Why do we discuss things in this childish way, and end up in so much bloodshed and so much falsity? Now we come to Gaza. Well, this is a genocide before our eyes. It's not even subtle, because you have these absolute extremists. Two cabinet ministers, one has recently resigned, Ben-Gvir, and the other Smotrich, who is still tentatively in the government, who talk openly about ethnic cleansing or destroying the Palestinian people, or expelling them from Palestine, or ruling over them, because there's no subtlety to it. They will dominate all of the territories from the river to the sea. Incidentally, in the US, when pro-Palestinian students said from the river to the sea, the police were called on them. But the river to the sea is the actual policy of Netanyahu's government, of the Likud party, which says that's all Israel's.
Right.
It's incredible. There's no sense of perspective. Stand back a little bit and understand what this is about. Now, just like in Ukraine, the core issue in Ukraine is the U.S. up against the Russian border. By every means, that's all that's at stake. In other words, if the United States says we won't do that, the war ends. The war in Gaza right now is all about one thing, which is that Israel says there will be no state of Palestine, no two-state solution, no peaceful coexistence between two peoples, no one state of democratic equality, nor two states living side by side, neither. Because the explicit policy of Israel, explicit is, we control everything. This has been Netanyahu's project his entire political career, which is now almost 30 years since he became prime minister. And it's the explicit policy of his party, the Likud. And then it's been joined by even more zealous so-called religious nationalist parties who take their cue from ancient texts which say, kill all the people there. This is the land promised by God to the Jewish people, and so forth. And taken literally, which is, we can do whatever we want. This is our land. Doesn't matter who's there. So there has been a bloodbath. There has been a slaughter. Every day it's U.S. weapons. Every day it's U.S. finance. And so the U.S. is complicit from morning till night, till morning till night, in this slaughter that has been going on. And the rest of the world is watching in dismay, horror, amazement, incredible consternation, but kind of a paralysis right now, what to do when Israel has no self-constraint and the United States does nothing, not anything for a single moment under the Biden administration to cause any restraint. The ceasefire that came in now is because of Trump, 100%. Blinken pushing Israel to a ceasefire? Are you kidding? We watched that show. It's impossible. It was absolutely ridiculous. To his credit, Trump said, I want a ceasefire before I come into office. And he sent his business buddy, Steve Witkoff, and apparently the Israelis trying to delay, said, don't come on the Sabbath. And Witkoff said, I'm showing up in your office tomorrow, no matter what day of the week it is. And he told them, you sign. And they signed. Now, what does this show, by the way? It shows that at any moment, the United States can end this. It's just like in Ukraine. This does not depend on Zelensky. He could fight with the sticks and stones, but if he wants missiles and armaments, it's the United States. Right. So the U.S. can end this any moment. With Israel, Israel cannot fight a single day without the United States support. Well, the Biden administration was completely complicit in this. I do expect that the International Court of Justice will find that Israel is in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. In other words, I do expect that this will be declared by the highest court in the world to be a genocide because the evidence is absolutely overwhelming.